Kaya, hello. Thank you for joining me on Whadjuk Noongar country. I'm Wadjuri Yamaji and Yuid Noongar, so I'm not from this country, and so I would like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands and waterways. I pay my respects to the Whadjuk Noongar peoples, to their ancestors and their elders. Australia will soon hold a referendum, which many call the voice to Parliament. I'm not here to tell you how you should vote. You might be uncertain how you will vote. As an Aboriginal woman and a law academic at the University of Western Australia, I can assure you that feeling uncertain is completely understandable. It is complicated. Anything to do with 100 years of injustice is complicated. And it is complicated for First Nations people. And I'm one of those people for which this is complicated. The referendum raises difficult questions. I hope that I'll be able to help you answer those questions for yourself. Some of those difficult questions are: why is Australia having a referendum? What does a referendum actually propose? Why is the voice to Parliament such a difficult and for some unsafe conversation to have with family and friends? And finally, how can you meaningfully contribute to a more just Australian nation? To understand where we are today with First Nations justice, I'm going to tell you how we got here. Understanding the referendum within the context of Australia's history will help you understand why it is so complicated for First Nations people. I can't give you a complete history, and so I won't. Australia is a settler colonial nation. Colonisation was not peaceful, and it was not lawful. It involved significant violence, theft, and dispossession of lands and resources against First Nations peoples. As the colonial project expanded across First Nation lands and the British colonies became more entrenched, there were huge concerns both here and in the United Kingdom over the mistreatment and unlawful killing of First Nations people by settlers. It was thought that colonisation was causing First Nations people to become a dying race. This led to the introduction of Aboriginal protection laws. Their effect was the segregation and control of First Nations people. They allowed for the removal of First Nations people from their lands onto reserves. They controlled where people could live, where they could work, who they could marry. They even allowed for their children to be removed. Towards the end of the 19th century, the White Australia policy was enacted. The goal was to ensure a white Australian population. New laws and policies restricted non-white migration into the colonies, and of course, the Aboriginal protection laws contributed greatly to the White Australia policy. In 1901, the Australian Constitution was enacted. Through this document, the national Australian identity was born. First Nations people were not included in the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution expressly excluded First Nations people. Section 127 expressly excluded First Nations people from being counted in the Commonwealth Australians population. And Section 5126, known as the race power, provided the Commonwealth Parliament with the power to make laws for the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race. According to Australia's first Prime Minister and one of the founding High Court judges, Sir Edmund Barton, Section 5126 was necessary to enable the Commonwealth to regulate the affairs of people of coloured or inferior races who are in the Commonwealth. And so racism and exclusion of people was embedded into the Australian Constitution and the Australian national identity from the very beginning. The consequence of the exclusion for First Nations people from the Constitution meant that First Nations people remained under the legal control of the newly formed states, so previously colonies. This meant that First Nation people weren't protected by the Constitution like everybody else, and that states could pass whatever laws they liked to control First Nations people. In 1937, the chief protectors of Aboriginals, as they were called, for each Australian jurisdiction convened an initial conference on Commonwealth and state Aboriginal authorities. The resolution from this conference was the assimilation policy. It was agreed that the destiny of the Aboriginal race lied in the absolute absorption of First Nations people into white Australian society. In essence, to breed out natives of Aboriginal origin. It was also agreed that the states would direct all of their efforts to achieving this end. And so Aboriginal protection laws were amended to eliminate the Aboriginal race as part of a long-term plan. The main approach was to remove First Nations children from their families and training them to live and act like white Australians. These children were placed into servitude with white families, and in some cases they were adopted into white families. In 1967, Australia realised that it was untenable to continue with such an oppressive legal regime. So in the 1960s, the world was becoming more and more connected through television, and so it was for the first time in history, the world was watching. So the 1967 referendum was held. The Commonwealth Parliament, as a result, could make laws with respect to First Nations peoples, regardless of where they lived in Australia, and to include First Nations peoples in the national population count. The referendum caused the Australian population to confront the racism embedded in Australia's foundational laws. From the 1967 referendum through to today, there have been improvements to the treatment and the inclusion for First Nations people in Australian society. But there has been no miracle transformation. The settler Australian justice system is adversarial. Australian laws do not roll across the land and protect people, they must be enforced. To assert your rights or to prevent your rights from being abused, you must bring legal action to the courts to resolve. Like this court, the trappings of justice ensure that great wealth is needed along with an impartial judge and an unbiased jury. This is unlikely for First Nations people in Australia. In fact, research from the late 1960s onwards has consistently found that 1 in 5 Australians hold explicit bias against First Nations Australians. A recent study has found that 3 in 4 Australians hold unconscious bias against Indigenous peoples. And let's be clear, racial bias is racism. What this means for First Nations people, the right to a fair trial in Australia, would be the exception and not the rule. And so, despite the 1967 referendum, progress towards justice and actual equality has been slow and hard-won. What has been demonstrated from multiple government reports throughout this time is that the disparity between First Nations people and non-Indigenous Australians is significant and it is increasing. The National Agreement on Closing the Gap provides an overview of the issues First Nations peoples have inherited as an ongoing consequence of colonisation. Closing the Gap is now in its second iteration. The first iteration failed. There are now 19 targets to closing the gap with regards to life expectancy, health, education, employment, housing, incarceration, and that's just to name a few. The latest Closing the Gap report can only report on 9 of the targets at this stage. There's not enough data to provide additional information. Of those 9, 4 are on track, 5 are not, although the report itself states that these results need to be used with caution. So, what does the referendum actually propose? In 2007, during the National Constitutional Convention at Uluru, a majority of First Nations people in attendance reached consensus on the next steps to constitutional recognition. And so the Uluru Statement from the Heart was written as an invitation to Australian people from First Nations Australians, and it focuses on voice, treaty, and truth. The Voice to Parliament is enactment of the first sequence in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The referendum question was passed by Parliament on the 19th of June 2023, so last week. It reads, "A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration?" The actual proposed law, which forms the constitutional amendment, will create a new section in the Constitution which acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia. That acknowledgement will establish that there shall be a body called the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Voice. It provides the voice may make representation to the Commonwealth Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to First Nation peoples. And finally, It delegates the power to Parliament to make laws on the composition, function, powers and procedures of that body. Why is the voice to Parliament such a difficult and for some unsafe conversation to have with friends and family? What is being proposed through the voice to Parliament is one of many steps to overcome the ongoing colonial injustice. It is a First Nations social justice movement. The reality is that it is a modest request. The body will effectively be communicating on behalf of all First Nations people throughout Australia on how existing or proposed Commonwealth laws are affecting people. The ability to make these representations formally is important. It is the first step to identifying where Australian laws are causing injustice and inequality. However, there is no obligation upon the Parliament or the Executive Government to do anything with the information received from the voice. There is a serious concern that Parliament Executive Government will do nothing with the information received from the voice, and that injustice and disparity experienced by First Nations people will continue to worsen. Unfortunately, those concerns are well made, or they're well founded. Parliament and the Executive Government already have information from many Royal Commission reports and law reform reports, which have provided information and recommendations on injustice and disparity. Many of these recommendations have not been implemented, and in some cases, the opposite has occurred. And so there is great distrust. The other significant concern is that the Australian population may be under the mistaken belief that voting yes on its own will create a just and equitable Australia. This was the experience following the 1967 referendum. The commentary in Australia was, we gave them the vote, what more do they want? And worse, we should not have given them the vote. These comments are very clear examples of explicit racism in Australia. Unfortunately, these comments are still present in Australia today. It is this racism that is causing the conversation about the current referendum to be so difficult. And for First Nations people, it is more than a difficult conversation, it is unsafe. Racism has a very real consequence on our ability to get jobs, houses, to receive fair treatment with hospitals, schools, the police, the judiciary, to access public transport, and to walk home safely from school. It is also unsafe for us to engage publicly in this conversation, and particularly unsafe online. The legacy of Australia's colonial history is extraordinarily uncomfortable for many Australians, but it is extraordinarily unsafe for First Nations people. As the Voice to Parliament referendum is seeking to address colonial injustice, it forces Australians to engage in some of our painful history, but also to look where that oppression still exists. It is incumbent upon every Australian to engage in the conversation with friends and families and to address the explicit and unconscious bias, racism, within the Australian population. How can you meaningfully contribute towards a more just Australian nation? Colonisation was not legally justifiable and it was inhumane. Everything done to take the lands from First Nations people and everything done to maintain control of those lands has come at the cost of First Nations people's freedom, our ability to live as free people in our own country. All Australians have inherited the consequence of colonial injustice. First Nations people have inherited the dispossession and oppression, whilst everyone else has benefited from that dispossession. Inheriting injustice does not mean that we have to live with injustice. You can contribute to a more just resolution between First Nations people and non-Indigenous Australians. If you are Australian, you are living on First Nations country. It is important to understand the First Nations people on whose land you live on. It is important to hear their voice and work with them to achieve equality and justice. You do not need to wait for the referendum in order to start working towards justice. If you vote yes for the referendum, understand that it is only the first step towards a just Australia. Yes, on its own, is not enough. Thank you.